US investigates claims American gear used in raids on Russia. Ukraine insists incursion on Russia's Belgorod region was conducted by Russians opposed to Putin. Washington is investigating reports that US military vehicles were used in raids on Russia, a White House official said Wednesday, warning Ukraine and pro-Ukraine forces against using US equipment to attack inside Russia. Two pro-Ukraine Russian paramilitary groups claimed responsibility for an incursion Monday into Russia's Belgorod region from Ukraine, in which they overran several small villages. Moscow said Wednesday it had defeated the groups, killing more than 70 people and destroying US-made military vehicles. U.S. National Security Council spokesperson John Kirby said Wednesday the White House is looking into those reports that the U.S. equipment and vehicles could have been involved, hinting at frustration in Washington. We've been pretty darn clear. We don't support the use of U.S.-made equipment for attacks inside Russia. We've been clear about that with the Ukrainians, Kirby said. I won't get into private discussions that we're having with them, but I think we've been nothing but consistent about our concerns in that regard. Pentagon spokesperson Brig. General Patrick Ryder on Tuesday said the U.S. had not authorized nor received Ukrainian requests for transferring equipment to paramilitary groups. He also expressed doubts about the Russian reports and images appearing to show US-made vehicles. I don't know if it's true or not in terms of the veracity of that imagery, said Ryder. You'll recall this week, there were some bogus images of reported alleged explosions at the Pentagon. So, all of us, both within the Defense Department, and I'm sure in the Defense Department, and I'm sure in the defense to community, have to take a look at these things and make sure we get the facts before we make assumptions. Ukraine has denied involvement in the attack, saying the two groups, Legion of Free Russia and Russian Volunteer Corps, consist only of Russian citizens who are fighting on Kiev's side, to create a demilitarized zone on the border with Ukraine. Andriy Chernyak, a representative of Ukraine's military intelligence told Politico that military aid provided by the U.S. and other Western allies is strictly limited for use by the Ukrainian army. Every bullet is tracked not only by us, but also by our Western allies, Chernyak said, adding he did not know where the paramilitary groups got the U.S.-made vehicles. While he insisted the groups acted on their own, Chernyak said has been in contact with them and has observed increased anti-Putin sentiment among Russians. Our main goal is to protect Ukraine. For us, those are Russian citizens who are against Putin and want to shake his regime. So we work with whoever we can to reach our main goal, Chernyak said. More and more in Russia understand they don't want to die for Putin at war. Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu described the groups as Ukrainian nationalists during a televised meeting with Russian military officials and displayed images of two severely damaged armored vehicles that look similar to those provided by the U.S. to Ukraine as part of military aid. During counter-terrorist operations, units of nationalist formations were blocked and defeated by airstrikes and artillery fire and active actions. The remnants of the nationalists were thrown into the territory of Ukraine, where the fight continued until they were completely eliminated, Shoigu said. The two groups themselves, however, claimed they were able to return to Ukraine with only 2 killed and 10 injured from the Legion of Free Russia, as well as 2 injured from the Russian Volunteer Corps. When asked about how they got US-made vehicles, Russian Volunteer Corps Denis Kapustin, AK White Rek, the same name as his white nationalist clothing line, joked that his fighters could have purchased them at any military store, mocking remarks from Vladimir Putin about how Russian-backed militants got weapons to fight Ukraine in Donbass in 2014. Kapustin also claimed his group had taken back military vehicles stolen from Ukraine. The goal of our peacekeeping operation into Belgorod region was also to destroy law enforcement serving Putin's regime and also demonstrate to the people of Russia that resistance is possible, the Legion of Free Russia said Tuesday. The Russian Volunteer Corps also claimed they wanted to show Russians they are not protected by Putin. The president's inbox recap. In Strategy in Ukraine, the latest episode of the president's inbox is live. This week, Jim sat down with Charles Kupchan, Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations and Professor of International Affairs at Georgetown University. They discussed the West's strategy in Ukraine and its role in negotiating the end of the war. The Ukrainian spring offensive could begin any day now. Charlie argues that Ukraine is waiting for two things before it launches its long, expected counteroffensive. First, Ukraine is trying to stock up on as much armor as possible. Charlie attributes much of Ukraine's success on the battlefield to the aid it has received from the West. Second, Ukraine is waiting for warmer, drier weather. Tanks and mud make a poor mix. Neither Russia nor Ukraine is ready to come to the negotiating table at the moment. The Ukrainian public overwhelmingly supports reclaiming every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. Putin insists that any peace talks recognize Russia's claim to Crimea and the Ukrainian oblasts of Donetsk, Kherson, Luhansk, and Zaporizhzhia. With neither Ukraine nor Russia willing to budge on these issues, there is little room for negotiations. Ukraine's spring offensive could create the conditions to begin negotiations come fall. Charlie is skeptical that Ukraine can defeat Russia on the battlefield. He expects Ukraine to reclaim some territory, but at a high cost that makes both sides more receptive to negotiations. That is why Charlie and CFR President Richard Helpless have argued that the West should help Ukraine have as successful a spring offensive as possible by giving weapons that it hasn't received yet, like longer range missiles and F-16s. Then, once the conditions are right, the United States and its allies could try to convince both sides to come to the negotiating table. As Charlie put it, the logic of our position is let's give everything that we can to Ukraine now to help it succeed and then begin to try to set the table for a diplomatic end game once this fighting season begins to wind down. China and India have already called for negotiations to end the war. Charlie argues that it might be wise for the United States to try to enlist China and India in any negotiating initiative it launches, even if that makes the diplomacy more complex. Charlie has been consistent in contending that the war in Ukraine will be settled at the negotiating table rather than on the battlefield. Last November, he argued in the New York Times that the United States and the West should be prepared to get involved in ending the war. This past February, he wrote in the Quincy Institute's Responsible Statecraft blog that the United States and its allies should ready plans for a diplomatic endgame before the fighting stops. Charlie has been explicit that his calls for the West to find a way to open a diplomatic track on the Ukraine war stem partly from his assessment that Western resolve is likely to falter in the coming months. Jim is more optimistic about Western solidarity. He and Ivo H. D'Alder, president of the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs and a former U.S. ambassador to NATO, wrote last fall that large majorities in Europe and North America understand that their security and freedom depend on Ukraine remaining free, independent, and part of the West. Those are the true stakes of this war, and it is why the West will stand firm. Either way, barring a decisive victory on the battlefield by either side, which seems unlikely, diplomacy will eventually be needed to end the war. How much aid has the U.S. sent Ukraine? Every year, the United States sends billions of dollars in aid, and much more than any other country, to beneficiaries around the world in pursuit of its security, economic, and humanitarian interests. Heading into 2022, U.S. foreign assistance was driven by various priorities of the Biden administration, including combating climate change, countering authoritarianism. But since Russia's invasion in February of that year, Ukraine has become far and away the top recipient of U.S. foreign aid. It's the first time that a European country has held the top spot since the Harry S. Truman administration directed vast sums into rebuilding the continent through the Marshall Plan after World War I. Since the war began, the Biden administration and the U.S. Congress have directed more than $75 billion in assistance to Ukraine, which includes humanitarian, financial, and military support, according to the Kiel Institute for the World Economy, a German research institute. The historic sums are helping a broad set of Ukrainian people and institutions, including refugees, law enforcement, and independent radio broadcasters, though most of the aid has been military-related. Dozens of other countries, including most members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the European Union, are also providing large aid packages to Ukraine. Much of the aid has gone toward providing weapons systems, training, and intelligence that Ukrainian commanders need to defend against Russia, which has one of the world's most powerful militaries. Many Western analysts say the military aid provided by the United States and other allies has played a pivotal role in Ukraine's defense and counteroffensive against Russia. And allied leaders consider Russia's invasion a brutal and illegal war of aggression on NATO's frontier that, if successful, would subjugate millions of Ukrainians, encourage Russian President Vladimir Putin's revanchist aims, and invite similar aggressions from other rival powers, especially China. Still, Ukraine has requested certain advanced equipment, such as fighter aircraft, that the United States and other donor governments have been thus far unwilling to provide, worried that doing so could escalate the war. NATO allies are particularly wary of being pulled directly into the hostilities, which would dramatically raise the risk of a nuclear war. However, as the fighting has progressed, they have steadily shed their reluctance to give Ukraine more sophisticated assets, such as battle tanks. 15 months into the war, the Biden administration had provided or agreed to provide Ukraine with a long list of defense capabilities, including Abrams battle tanks, anti-aircraft missiles, coastal defense ships, and advanced surveillance and radar systems. When compared with U.S. assistance to other top recipients, both in recent years and in decades past, the extraordinary scale of this aid comes into view. However, the magnitude of U.S. aid to Ukraine might seem less remarkable in comparison to what the Pentagon is budgeted each year or what the Treasury was authorized via the Troubled Asset Relief Fund to bail out Wall Street banks, auto companies, and other sectors of the economy during the U.S. financial crisis. When compared with the critical support to Ukraine from other countries, the size of U.S. aid stands out. However, some European governments, such as Latvia and Estonia, are making larger financial contributions to Ukraine relative to the size of their own economies